Hello. Welcome to the ALCTS Webinar on Preserving Digital Collections, the third and final installment of the Library Preservation Series. I'm Karen Kiorpis, a member of the ALCTS Preservation and Reformatting section, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Peter Verheyen, currently the Research and Emerging Issues Analyst at Syracuse University Library. Peter comes from a bookbinding and rare book conservation background. He has worked as a conservator in private practice at Yale and Cornell University libraries. In 1995, Peter established the Conservation Lab at Syracuse University Libraries and served as head of preservation and conservation until 2013. Peter was involved in digitization activities at Syracuse and managed many projects in the Special Collections Research Center. We are fortunate to have his expertise with us today. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise. Please note we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for Peter, please type them into the question box on your screen. This webinar is being recorded. You will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides. And now, here is Peter. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Hello. Hello and welcome to Preserving Digital Collections, an Overview. Thank you for the introduction, Karen, and look forward to speaking with you for the next hour. We will remain on schedule, I hope. If not, I will be prodded. So this is the third part of a three-part series, and in the previous sessions we learned about the importance of environmental monitoring and controlling your environment so that you can prevent damage to your collections. We learned about library storage, how to achieve better conditions, low-cost, no-cost improvements, which are really, really important, not just for small historical collections, but also for the big research libraries. We learned about storage furniture, so shelving, and the issues related to those, such as allowing airflow around them, the storage areas, keeping things clean, keeping things well lit when you're working in there, keeping the environment in control, care and handling of books, which are fragile. They can be damaged, and especially with scrapbooks, which was the context from Danya's presentation, they can be in horrible condition and have a multitude of other problems as well. And you learned about the difference between scrapbooks and more normal books. So, a little historical context, and I like to call this kind of rock, paper, scissors. What we see here are a cuneiform tablet, an incunabula, Peter Waters, blowing a brittle book to pieces, and microfilm. And then we have this thing down here, which some of you may recognize and others don't. And there are some important similarities and differences between these different objects and formats. Actually, let me go back. Despite all the problems that we may have with things like a cuneiform tablet, an incunabula, a brittle book, microfilm, we can read them. We can piece them back together if need be. With digital technology, with digital file formats, that's not a given. And it's very easy to lose something completely. If a disk becomes corrupted, you really have very little hope of piecing things back together again, especially if it's extensive. If you have a brittle book, a good conservator can piece that back together again on a light table and either make a copy from that or line it or do something else. So digital media present real problems, especially moving forward. And it's something I like to call the buy now, pay forever scheme. So a few definitions and terms. Digital preservation is not the digitization of analog objects, but the formats and standards that we use to digitize these things have a real impact on their long-term preservation. And in teaching the fundamentals of preservation online class, one of the things that we try to make clear very early on is that simply digitizing something does not preserve that object, although it might, and that digital copy will need preservation moving into the future. It is not preservation in and of itself. Digital preservation, just like analog preservation, is part of a curation process, and the management of those assets over time ensures their continued accessibility. There's an extensive bibliography and other resources at the end of this presentation, and if we have time, we'll go over some of those things as well. So we have our first quiz, and I will, let's see, and that is to ask, are you currently digitizing collections? So let's take a minute and let's see what you all come up with. Okay, an interesting mix about okay. Has everybody had time? All right. Why don't we close that now, and hopefully you'll be able to see the results. And so these are the results for this poll, and most of you are doing a combination of these activities. 20% aren't doing any digitization, and 20% are doing still images, which are the easiest in many respects to digitize. So I'm going to hide the poll now, and let's see. Okay, that'll work. All right, so let's go on to our next slide. So one of the most important things to consider when you're digitizing anything, and that's incredibly important for the preservation of the digital, is metadata. And you really, if you don't have metadata, which is a word with 8 letters, it's data that describes the object, that describes other data, you really want to consider digitization and whether or not you want to do that, because you need to be able to describe the objects that you have for discovery. You need to be able to describe them in terms of what file formats, what are their relationships, administrative things such as who's responsible, all of these. And there's the premise data dictionary is a very, very extensive list. You don't have to use everything, but the more you have and the more context you can provide to those people who are going to be ensuring that your digital collection remains sustainable, the better that is. What kinds of digital objects do we have? The majority of digital collections right now, the materials that you see online, are digitized analog, and that can be text, as in the case of something like APTrust, which is the research library variant of Google Books, image collections, audio from historic media such as Cylinder. Syracuse is doing a lot with that. 78's audio tape. We have video on tape. We have film, as in, motion picture film. And then we get into things that are born digitized. And those are computer files in any number of different formats. Sometimes we have control, sometimes we don't. There are files and digital files that are on tape. Those will have a combination of problems similar to the analog. Can you read the tapes? On disks, CDs and DVDs, servers, do you know what you have, where it is? We have programs and software. A lot of that is going to be proprietary. Some of that might be open source. Sometimes you don't know what it is because nobody labeled the disk or the drive or whatever it is that you have, and that's a problem with analog objects as well. How many of us have labeled our photographs? And then you have things like websites, email, social media that are a whole nother can of worms, and that organizations are attempting to get a handle on, such as Library of Congress with Twitter. what can we do to facilitate preservation as we are digitizing collections? One of the most important things to do is to adhere to standards and best practices when we create those digital objects. We need to digitize at the highest appropriate or practical resolution. That helps create a use-neutral master that should be in a lossless, stable, non-proprietary format. A TIFF image, a JPEG 2000, a WAV, or an AVI. If you get into proprietary formats, and there are a whole lot of those, especially on the AV side of things in terms of audio and video, then you may not have enough information about what goes into creating that file format to be able to preserve it in the long term. And preserving there's a lot of steps to it that we're going to get into. With a lot of media, you may not have control. So if you go out and you buy yourself a new digital camera, there's any number of different formats that it may or may not be using. Sometimes you have a choice and can select, other times you don't. But you may still need to preserve that content, especially if you get into things like community-created collections, where anybody involved with the project can go out, can record things, and then you have to assimilate those into your collection. Because some of these things are so complicated, and not just from the production standpoint, but also from the management standpoint, you may very well, especially if you don't have that kind of infrastructure, want to outsource that to professional digitization vendors and work collaboratively to present that digital content so that you're not doing it alone. If you're doing it alone and you don't know what the next step is, you could run into real problems. When you're working with files, write protect the master images so that they can't be altered, and that also will force people to work from derivatives. So you digitize an image collection, you have your master images. Because you're paranoid, because you don't know who else has access to it, you can write protect that whole folder that those images are in. People will open those up. They can make screen images from those, but they can't overwrite the original. There's no easier way to lose content than to do that. Use logical naming conventions and gather metadata as you work on the collection. So, do something where it's sequential, something that may associate it with the collection. So name of the collection in brief form 0001 if you've got 999 images or something like that. Don't save or preserve as you think you're preserving them on media such as CDs, DVDs, flash drives, or other proprietary storage systems. CDs, DVDs can go bad fairly quickly, even if they say these are guaranteed to last 100 years. And in 100 years, who will know what a CD drive is? Flash drives go through the laundry, get lost, probably not labeled. Other proprietary storage devices at Syracuse, we participated in a very early, this was in, I believe, the late 80s, early 90s digital project for adult education materials. We worked with, and this was well before my time, with a vendor that had proprietary hardware and software. That project was lost before it even got off the ground. And know the rights to the materials that you're digitizing, because that's something that you're going to have to consider as you publish that information online. And there's a great tutorial about digital preservation best practice and guidelines. This is that's from North Carolina, that will help you think about those things as you plan to digitize your collection. So let's talk about preserving digital objects. And first, another poll. So what are you currently storing your digital objects on? Okay. All right, everybody's voted. Excellent. So we've got a pretty good mix of storage solutions here. Servers and in the cloud is the vast majority of you. Hard drives are also part of server architecture, but by hard drives, and I probably should have qualified this, I'm talking about the hard drive on your computer or some external drive that you just plug in. 33% of you on media, I hope you get that to the servers as soon as you can so you can do backups. And for the 10% of you that aren't, based on who was registered for this, I'm going to hope and assume that it's those of you who haven't started projects yet and are gathering information. So we'll close this and move on. So this is an analog management chain for preservation, and it's based on the OAIS model, which is the open, oh God, all right, remind myself about that later, move forward. So what you have is you have the publisher of the information, which is, in this case, a publisher of a book or something like that, and it comes into the library via acquisitions. It needs to get cataloged. It will need to go into the stacks. Those need to be managed as well, and then into the OPAC so that the patron can access it. Preservation planning helps ensure that those collections remain sustainable and accessible. Administration, through providing positions, through providing the building and money, ensures that everything can happen. And so this OAIS, Open Archival Information System model, can be translated to an analog world. As we mentioned earlier, digital content is fragile. Media and storage devices will degrade or become obsolete quickly. So you're going to have ongoing replacement costs for your media. You know, whether that's replacing hard drives on an ongoing basis, calling out for old hardware, software, especially if you've got born digital objects that are on 5.5-inch floppy disks and things like that. You've got software, file formats, and operating systems that are obsolete. How many of you have, early DOS versions that you could load on a computer and run in some kind of emulation? A lot of software is not written to be backwards compatible anymore. So even if you have a Word file, you can only go back so far. Proprietary encoding schema, they will disappear fairly quickly. Files get deleted, and this was interesting because there was an early working group on digital preservation, and their listserv communications, this is in the early 90s, were archived, and then Yale, it was archived at Yale, noticed that, well, nobody's posting anything anymore, and they deleted that archive. That archive was able to be recreated because some of the members of that list had kept every posting, and even if they hadn't, there was enough overlap that they could recreate the archive. And then you get into things, especially if you're archiving web pages, social media, web links break. The context gets lost for those, and sometimes that's intentional, other times it's not. I know that, for example, some collections that use the Internet Archive software for archiving websites, external links will not work. So if you're referring to other collections, those links are broken, and if they're hidden behind text, people may not be able to access those objects. So what kinds of strategies and tools do we need? Storage, it's essential, but it's only the first step, and backups are not preservation. They can help preservation. Refreshing, refreshing can be as simple as moving objects from one physical storage medium to another. So you're starting to worry about that hard disk or that CD-ROM, you move it to the next medium. And it's a way to avoid physical decay and obsolescence that may make that object unreadable. Migration, is also critical. So you've got file formats, and while the ones that we use the most, such as TIFF, have been around for a very long time, there's no guarantee of that. So as new formats come along and are identified as being critical, you can rest assured that somebody will find some way to migrate those forward. An example of that might be PDF. There's a huge critical mass of that, and somebody will find a way to migrate PDF files forward. And then there's emulation, and this is something that's really useful. The Internet Archive is emulating old video games, old software, including operating systems, but basically what it does is it creates an environment in which you're virtually running that old software on your modern, up-to-date computer. And that can be a way to gain access or to at least manipulate obsolete file formats. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask them, and we can go on otherwise. So curation, something I mentioned earlier, and curation is an integral part of managing collections, whether they're analog or digital. And curation is it's critical for success of any kind of preservation. And so when you're curating a collection, you're making decisions as to why are you acquiring it, why is it important, why do you need to keep it, and a host of other kind of issues that you discuss. It's not necessarily a hard process, but it cuts really across organizational lines and across media, formats, processes, everything. And like metadata, if you're not engaged in curation activities, you're going to have problems long term. So as you're planning for digital preservation, you need to develop a plan for managing each file format in a digital archive. And that is going to have a lot of very specific questions attached to it and policies and procedures. So you may have specific strategies. We have this collection on some kind of video format that has a very low adopted, a very low user base, and we don't know how long it's going to be around. So when you acquire that collection during the curation process, you might want to say, let's migrate it to this other format now. And then we can migrate that forward. You're still going to keep the original source format. You'll establish policies. You'll involve your bibliographers, your catalogers, faculty who might be using those collections, researchers that are external to your organization. You want to incorporate digital preservation into all your existing collection development policies and workflows, especially if you're talking about things that affect everyone. So directory structure, naming conventions. If you're creating, and you have different areas within your organization creating digital collections, something you might want to, build into that workflow. All your policies have to address intellectual property rights and access. You want to document your best practices. How are you doing things? Why did you make that decision? If as you go along things change and you wish you hadn't done that, document why. And you also want to develop preservation metadata guidelines for the organization as things are created, as things are migrated. Excuse me one second. As you go along with this, you want to review things on a regular schedule, as in politics, especially Chicago politics, early and often. Revise things if you see red flags. Don't wait. It needs to, in order to be sustainable, it needs to be a collaborative effort between departments and organizations if it's something you're doing consortially. And it requires resources and organizational commitment. People across your organization need to buy into it. They need to be aware of the resources that you have, why they're important, and what's involved in their creation and management. You need to, as people are working with these, really encourage and require good habits and standardization. You don't want to go off and just make things up as you go. You will run into problems with that. Sustainability with digital preservation is critical, and a trusted digital repository is a really good way of describing those concepts that go into ensuring that a collection is sustainable. And I'm not going to read all of these, but as you look at them, you will see that a lot of them have absolutely nothing to do with selecting specific hardware, specific software, specific workflows. It's really about who's responsible for these assets, what the organization needs to do in order to make sure that that collection remains viable and sustainable into the future, who's going to pay for it, how, methodologies for evaluating those collections, carrying things on long term. We've been living with digital collections for maybe 25 years now, and that's nothing compared to print collections or earlier things like cuneiform tablets, where even with the traditional codex form, we're talking about over 1,000 years at this stage. And in 1,000 years with very little intervention, and they can still be read. I'll leave out knowing the languages, being able to read the script, but it can still be interpreted and seen. So the concepts of the Trusted Digital Repository really outline all those things and make you think about what it is. They're not proscriptive, but they're guidelines, and it's something that you really want to keep in mind. You can become a certified Trusted Digital Repository, but even if you're not going to go that route, trying to follow as much of this as possible will really help ensure that your collection does remain viable. So here we have our Open Archival Information System as it's designed for digital collections, and the producer could really be anybody. It could be your organization that's digitizing collections. It could be crowdsourced, and when those things are submitted to the collection, they're ingested, and you may have a form to fill out. That becomes your submission information package. It'll have descriptive information. It'll have archival information. It'll get managed. Whoever's responsible for creating and finalizing that metadata will do that. The IT support and infrastructure, and then it gets made accessible, and you can query that collection, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. But you can see that preservation planning and administration are still key to all of these things. So our Open Archival Information System is really a basic framework for understanding the concepts of long-term digital preservation. It's not prescriptive. Like the concept of a TDR, it guides the process to allow us to implement a sustainable digital preservation program. And the wiki definition for this is actually pretty good. It's fairly concise. There's a lot more that you can read about it that's very techy, very high, not high level, but very detailed. And so it's worth looking at. We shouldn't poo-poo wiki all the time. So in the next part of the presentation, what we're going to do is look at a few digital preservation initiatives and tools. And I've divided these into different categories. We have cooperative projects such as Locks and Clocks, Portico, and then APTrust and Deepen, which are fairly new on the scene, but which are, we'll get into that, large consortial digital preservation projects. You also have hosted options that consumers, so libraries, smaller organizations can use, such as Digital Archive at OCLC. There's DuraSpace, DSpace Direct, which is hosted by digital preservation from DSpace. And what these digital preservation initiatives do is they will preserve that digital content. So Locks, Clocks, and Portico really are there to preserve published scholarly outputs, such as journal articles, ebooks, and to a lesser degree, locally digitized collections. They all use different conceptual models, and they're largely cooperative and scalable. So by being cooperative and scalable, you can really spread those costs and the responsibilities for supporting that across the partners. And they involve libraries, consortia, and publishers. Locks and Clocks it's not Dr. Seuss, but it's a grassroots international community that really, the software is fairly simple, and what it is as a member of Locks or Clocks, you essentially commit to storing everyone else's digital content, and for that model to work, there needs to be a minimum number of participants. I believe it's somewhere around 6, and so if at least 6 libraries commit to preserving that content, then if the content at one organization on one server is corrupted, it can be recreated, refreshed from the verified content at other partner organizations. Locks and Clocks are interesting because they ingest the content as it was originally published, so PDF, HTML, and although a lot of this hasn't really been tried and trigger events haven't really happened which require the content to be published or migrated, the presumption is that it gets migrated on access. So, and then you can also use lock software to create a small private locks network between, if you decide up here in central New York, we want to create our own private locks network for our regional historical collections, we can do that. Whereas Locks works with collections, and it works a lot with publishers. Clocks is specifically for working with publishers of content, so journal publishers and things like that. And Locks and Clocks, there's a lot of overlap between those collections. Portico works, in contrast to Locks, Portico works with publishers of scholarly literature in electronic form. And what it does is, like Locks, it's a dark archive, and Portico will convert those file formats. So if I'm publishing things in PDF, in HTML, in XML, and something else, they will convert it to their standard format, which is XML based, on ingest. So that way everything has the same format and it can be migrated en masse as those formats change. But the mission is very similar to Clocks. It's preserving scholarly literature. E-journals are part of that challenge as well, and with both of these, Locks, Clocks, and Portico, their collection development policies and missions have moved a lot closer together, and there is that overlap. What's interesting is that it doesn't really increase the number of titles being preserved, and this is something the Too Cool project, which is Columbia University Libraries and Cornell University Libraries, are doing a lot of joint collection development, and they did a study in which they looked at what the overlap was, and there's a lot of overlap between those different collections and a lot of things that aren't being preserved. And that's a report that's well worth reading. And it does give us, it's an opening for what could we preserve together. For locally created collections, there's APTrust and Deepen, and these were created, I'd say, they started to be created in the last 4 or 5 years. And they're both cooperative ventures, but APTrust is a little bit different in that it's also an access tool. Deepen isn't. And the diagram from the APTrust site really describes that. And what they have is it's a repository. And any member can deposit their things in APTrust. They will then, that content can be made accessible via APTrust. They can also designate some of that content or all of it to be deposited in Deepen, which is a dark archive, which has as other nodes HathiTrust, Chronopolis, Texas, California Digital Library, and those different nodes are all running a slightly different architecture. And the way they described it when that project was being created was it's kind of the space shuttle mode. There's multiple redundant systems, but they're all different. If one of them fails, you can still keep flying. And so just as with locks, with Deepin, if one of those nodes fails, that content can be refreshed. And in more detail, APTrust, it's a consortium of academic libraries. And so it was started at the University of Virginia. There's well over 12 libraries now. They collaborate with Fedora, DuraCloud, CloudSync, all the big vendors on the development of the software. And as I said, it's a preservation and access tool. And the intent is that it will migrate forward standard file types. So again, that takes you back to digitizing that collection and really looking at what are the formats that you're going to use as you digitize your content to facilitate that process. Deepin, it's conceptually aligned with APTrust, but as I said, it's a dark archive, and each of those nodes runs on a different platform. But what's also interesting is that format migration is not a planned feature of Deepin. So once things are put into Deepin, that's the file format that they're going to stay in. Presumably, if you've got the preservation metadata and you've documented things and that's all part of it, when you submit the information into Deepin, you will hopefully be able to recreate things, but that's really the darkest of dark archives. And once things are deposited there, they can't be or shouldn't be able to be deleted. And so one of the things that people think about when they deposit things in Deepin are succession rights. So Syracuse University Library is a member of Deepin, or we deposit our things in there. What happens when Syracuse University goes belly up because now everybody's using the University of Phoenix instead? Who owns that content? And that's something to think about. Other digital preservation tools, we have OCLC's Digital Archive, which is something that it's secure managed storage, it's got automated workflows, it works seamlessly with Content DM, which is it can be locally hosted but also hosted in the cloud. It's a great, fairly basic digital collections publication tool, and by working seamlessly with it, the content that you have in that online collection is also preserved. And the hosted option is great, especially if you don't have that kind of infrastructure in-house. DSpace Direct is also a low-cost turnkey hosted repository service, and it can be used also in conjunction with things like institutional repositories. And an important thing to remember is that institutional repositories aren't necessarily preservation either, although they can serve as a preservation tool. They will need to be preserved in and of their own right. So why do we preserve digital collections? And why do we engage in all this effort and expense of doing that? Digital preservation, it's an insurance policy, and chances are, especially if you've got a very large critical mass moving forward, you're going to need to cash in on parts of that more often than you think. I remember some early digitization projects I did at Syracuse. This was in the late 1990s, around 98, 99. Disk storage was expensive. We were told that Gold CD Media was our preservation storage system. We were supposed to catalog all those CDs, put them in the stacks, put flags into the MARC record to remind us to check them maybe once a year to see whether they were still there. That workflow didn't work out quite as well, but as infrastructure changed, we were putting those collections online. We wanted to redo it. One of the other things as we created those digital collections is we created the screen images for what most people were using at the time, which was 640 by 480. As we moved to bigger monitor resolutions, those images looked really pathetically small, like thumbnails. So we wanted to go back to that original content. We found that of those CDs, maybe 10% were unreadable. That was a real problem. When you have preserved content such as journals that you've subscribed to, presumably the publisher's helping preserve those with Portico or locks, but if they go belly up, then you have things like trigger events. We've gotten a few questions in here, and premise is, it's a dictionary. It's a thesaurus for digital preservation. And that's something that I will address. I can address a little bit more in some follow-up slides. I need to look at that again. So before I say something that's completely wrong, I'll defer that. In terms of how do I write protect digital files, if you remember your old floppy disks, there was a little tab that you could flick or put tape over. On content that's stored on your hard disk, you can go in, I don't know how Macs work, but in PCs and Windows, you can right-click on file properties for that and say write protect, and that means that those files cannot be overwritten. So if you open up that file and you make changes to it, it will make sure that you save it to something else, and it really is easy. In terms of how often to migrate things, that's really something where you need to keep an eye on what's happening with files, with technology in general. Is it a hardware or is it a software issue? Sometimes it's both. You know, we all have in our collections, we still have collections with floppy disks in them, but do you have a floppy disk drive? If you don't have a floppy disk drive or have access to one, then those disks are useless. I mean, there's really nothing you can do about those, and you probably should have migrated those earlier, but whether, to migrate those, that's a big decision. If you process it as part of an archival collection, was it even flagged? You know that it's there. That's an issue. If the software, if you hear that the TIFF image is being phased out and you've got 500,000 TIFF images in your collection, if JPEG 2000 is the next thing, then you will want to set up a workflow to start migrating those to that new format. And fortunately, a lot of that can be done in batch processing using tools. You can do that. For example, if your collection is small, you can do it fairly easily, even in Photoshop. But you have to know what you're doing, and if you're not sure, there are vendors who will migrate these files for you. Our institutional repository is with bpress as well. bpress is running backups, but it's not really preservation in the long-term sense. It's not preservation as we are thinking of it. You will definitely, I think, want to store backups of their backups on your servers. If you are a member of a preservation consortium, you may well want to figure out how you can contribute that content to that collection, even if it's just as a dark archive. You could put it on something like a private locks network, depending on size, but you need to make sure that your infrastructure can handle it. I know institutional repositories can get quite large, but institutional repositories in and of themselves are not preservation. What they do is they're an access tool. They're great for dissemination. They're great for storing metadata, but what happens with those files, with that format long term? It will probably need to be migrated as well, and that's something that you need to think about, but don't rely on the vendors to do that. Keep your eye on the, on the pulse of what's happening out there. Communicate with your vendors, ask questions. I hear this is coming up. How can I prepare for that? What are you doing to ensure that our content will remain viable? talking about some of these consortial things again, APTrust, which is a member of APTrust, is also can be used to publish collections if you are a member of it. But because it's also an access tool by essentially anyone, you need to make sure that what you put in there is either accessible by copyright or can be flagged not to be published. APTrust can also be a fantastic preservation tool for analog collections and for providing accessibility. For, let's say, print impaired, if you need a screen reader or something like that. If you hold an item in APTrust and you're a member and you hold a print copy locally, but it can't be circulated, it can't be used, and you want to make that accessible, you can, because you're holding that print copy, get access locally for that digital copy. You can also, as a member, download that digital copy, print it, send it to your library binder, to put in your stacks if you so choose. You can also make that digital copy available for access, so using a screen reader or something like that, blowing it up so that it's larger and easier to read. But one of the things to remember is that the OCR behind it that a screen reader would need to use is only as good as the original scans. And for my own part, I'm working a lot in German language publications, late 19th century, early 20th century, a wide variety of fonts, brittle paper that's very yellowed, not a lot of contrast, and that OCR can be very spotty for a screen reader. So you may want to do cleanup, or there are other things that you may need to do for that to make that content useful. But APTrust is really an amazing resource. So what can we do in easy steps? To keep an eye on what's happening in the digital preservation world and to read what a digital archivist does, there's a lot of good readings, and we'll get into some of those. A basic job description, not in the administrative sense, but what does a digital archivist really do, was written on an OCLC research blog post, and it gives a really great overview of the different skill sets that you would need, what kinds of projects they're involved with, who they interact with. You need to know what you have as content, and in terms of different media types, you need to organize and maintain a logical directory structure. You want to limit yourself to certain stable and established formats. When you migrate forward or backwards as formats change, think about what's the lowest common denominator. If you've got databases, for example, you don't want to keep those in the latest, Excel format. You might want to take it all the way back to a comma delimited that you can then work with moving forward. Make use of metadata. You shouldn't be digitizing anything without it. And as you're working, enter that metadata into your own database, into a spreadsheet for a collection that keep track of every item that's in there, file formats, any local notes, access notes, preservation notes. Keep your head out of the cloud except for access. And there are cloud-based solutions that are being used, such as the Amazon cloud is being used by APTrust, Deep, and organizations like that. But don't store things in Flickr or Google Photos except for access, because once you deposit them there, you really have no control over how they're used and what they do with them. And if they change their model, it could be gone overnight. Keep and maintain obsolete hardware as you have it. You just might, especially if you're dealing with born digital formats, and find partners with which to share resources and costs. So at this point, I'm going to say thank you and really open it up for questions if there are more. If you have questions, type them into the question box. And while I'm waiting for those to come in, I'm going to say thank you to my colleagues Karen Kiorpis for introducing me and just for being a really great colleague all around, Julie Mosbo and Danya Khan for having presented the earlier webinars, and all of you for your attendance here. And so what I've got at the end of the slides that you will also be getting, that will be sent to you pretty much right after this presentation, is a list of resources that's fairly extensive. Moving Theory into Practice, which was written by Cornell University Library, is a really, really thorough, comprehensive, and accessible to a wide variety of audiences digitization tutorial. And it lays the groundwork also for digital preservation. Northeast Document Conservation Center has a handbook for digital preservation. Federal agencies, Digitization Guidelines Initiative, published theirs online, and those are basically the guidelines for that any government agency would use for digitizing their content. And all of these things are freely available and accessible. The National Digital Information Infrastructure Preservation Program has a huge amount of resources that are available to them and that they are sharing with you. Also, a lot of other digital preservation resources. So ALA has different definitions for digital preservation from the most basic to the fairly deep. There are initiatives such as POWER, which is preserving objects with restricted resources. That's a lot of digital preservation tips for libraries and smaller organizations that don't have very significant, in terms of volume, digital collections. Community-owned digital preservation tools repository. You know, they had Cornell again, and it's now at University of Michigan, an excellent tutorial for digital preservation. Trusted Digital Repositories, our colleagues in the UK have something on preserving digital collections. There's just an awfully good amount of information that's out there. We also have, for more lay audiences, something that you may want to share with your boards if you're in a smaller organization. Popular articles on digital preservation and preserving your digital, and that can be your personal digital legacy. Some questions that are coming in. So somebody's asking about listservs for digital preservation. That would be useful. There is DigiPres, which is an international, that's D-I-G-I-P-R-E-S, an international listserv for digital preservation. It's fairly active. People are sharing projects on there. You'll see a lot of announcements for webinars, conferences, things like that. Definitely worth subscribing to. We have a question here about using Microsoft 365 cloud storage for digital preservation. No. It's a good place for a backup if you're working locally, but you know, if you're a small organization, and New York State is fortunate because we really do have very active library consortia here. You know, to use New York State as a model, we may want, our 3Rs may want to say, let's set up a private locks network for storing things. And preserving them forward. That could be a consortia-wide activity planned. That would be a much better alternative that's lower cost. Again, for the premise, that's something, the metadata, I'll share that in notes that will come out after the workshop. But knowing that an images was created with Photoshop, it can help with doing something, because even Photoshop, if you manipulate an image, there are certain proprietary things that you can do in Photoshop that might not be available in PaintShop Pro. And so knowing what it was done in can be very, very helpful. The more you know, the better it is, but I think part of your question is also, it seems really easy to go overboard with these things, and I think that can be the case. You need to use judgment. You need to think things through. I would err on the side of caution and include more. Yes, a lot of good metadata, schema for capturing digital objects, METs, mods, MARC, all of those can also work together. There's a lot of information on there, and I will provide more. It's not something I've thought about providing in the context of this, so look for follow-up after the workshop, after the webinar. Other resources, digital preservation in a box, something made available by the Library of Congress and their DP outreach program. It's a lot of tools that you can download. Really interesting. That is ALCTS and other organizations have had a lot of really good workshops on this and webinars on this topic, and they're all worth looking at. If you're interested in format obsolescence, there is a video called Future States. Basically, it's in a nice dystopian future, and what happens with a CD and getting that information off. And it's accessible to any number of audiences. Team Digital Preservation, animated cartoons in the old school style for those of us who are 40 and above who remember Speed Racer and all those nice 70s cartoons. It's along those lines, but really, really good information that describes bit rot, format migration, things like that. Ditto with Snow Bite and the 7 Formats, which was produced by the Library of Congress. Entertaining and valuable information, and that is the end of my slides.
Thank you, Peter. This is Karen Kiorpa speaking. Peter, it's great what you've done for us today. You gave us both a really nice general overview of what digital preservation is and a lot of details for the implementation. Bravo, and all of you who are listening, do go investigate that long list of resources that Peter has provided in the slides when they're sent, when the link is sent to you. We trust you found today's session useful. You will receive an email with a link to the recording and slides within 2 days. The email also will include a link to a short evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions, as your comments help the Continuing Education Committee improve its webinars and plan future events. Also, you now have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance. That information will be in the email too. Thanks to our presenter, Peter Verheyen. Thanks also to members of the Continuing Education Committee and Megan Doherty from the ALCTS office. The support they provide make it possible for us to present these webinars. We have many events coming up. We will have 2 additional webinars on topics related to preservation during Preservation Week. Additional webinars are scheduled covering topics such as oral history, WebDewey, and tools for metadata automation. Please see the ALCTS website for more information on these. ALCTS also offers web courses which are 4 to 6 weeks long and e-forums which are 2-day email discussions. Thank you for joining us today. This concludes our session.